Capua, 71 years after Christ. A girl from Thrace is chained beneath the arena floor, knees pressed into stone, breath trembling through bloodied lips. Above her, 20,000 spectators scream for death. Below, she waits to be claimed, not by a master, not by a merchant, but by a man who just killed 3 others in the sand. He does not know her name, and Rome does not care if she lives. She is his prize now. One more victory, one more reward. This is how the empire celebrated triumph with flesh. Elira had not spoken since her father's execution. There had been no trial, no words, only spears. She remembered the way his body jerked in the dirt, the way the crowd laughed, the way the guards forced her to keep watching. They had brought her here 6 days ago, covered in the same clothes she wore when they dragged her from her family's villa. Her white linen tunic, once soft and perfumed, was now stiff with sweat, ash, and the scent of old blood. She was 16. Her wrists ached from the iron cuffs. The floor beneath her knees was cold, wet, and smelled of old rot meat, urine, copper. The cell was narrow, barely wider than her outstretched arms. She had not seen the sun in 3 days. A torch burned faintly in the corridor beyond her bars, and behind that glow, footsteps. At first, Elira thought the man who appeared was another guard, but he did not carry a torch. He was taller, older, and dressed in the leather-strapped armor of a gladiator. His arms were scored with scars, his knuckles cracked open. She saw blood, fresh. The door creaked open. She did not move. The gladiator did not speak. Behind him, a Roman official read from a wax tablet, voice flat, as if listing shipments of grain. Elira of Thrace, Category 3, assigned to Tiberius Gracchus under the law of contest rewards. A stylus scratched against the tablet. The door closed. The lock turned. Elira was alone with the man Rome had given her to. Her hands curled into fists. She waited. The cell had iron rings on the wall, drainage in the stone. A bench placed exactly where it needed to be. This was not a cell. It was a room designed for use. The gladiator stepped closer. Elira kept her eyes down. She had learned not to look up, not to speak, not to hope. But then, the man sat, not on the bench, not beside her. He sat against the opposite wall, quiet. Still, his sword hand rested on his knee. He said nothing, and for the first time in weeks, Elira looked up. He was staring at nothing, jaw clenched, chest heaving, as if he was holding back something far heavier than violence. The reward system had not started with cruelty. It had started with math. Rome paid its gladiators in more than coins, because coins could be stolen, taxed, lost in dice games, or drained by managers who kept 2 sets of books. But a woman, especially one from an enemy noble house, could be delivered quietly. No money changed hands, no debt was owed, just a body marked for use. Gladiators learned quickly what a Category 3 meant. The best of the captives, not for labor, not for brothels. These were the daughters of the conquered, preserved for spectacle. Their blood carried lineage, their eyes carried defiance, that made their breaking more valuable. Every arena had a system. In Capua, it lived in the stone beneath the sand, hidden from the crowds but not from the men who served it. Tiberius Gracchus had known the layout since his 2nd year. 20 narrow rooms lined the eastern corridor, all with the same design: cold walls, fixed chains, benches without backs, a single drain carved into the floor. He had been in 4 of them: room 9 with a girl from Gaul, room 12 with one from Judea, room 17 with someone whose name he never asked. They blurred. Their faces, their voices, all of them processed, recorded, and disposed of in silence. This one was different. She had not begged, not flinched. She had not even looked at him. Her stillness was not submission. It was something else, something hardened. She had already seen death. Maybe she had already died. Her body was still here, but her soul Tiberius wasn't sure. He remembered his own sister, 11 years old, when they were taken from their village. She had not cried either, just stared as their father was flogged to death for unpaid taxes. That was before the mines, before the training pits, before the matches. before he learned that survival came not from rage, but from patience. In the silence of the cell, he watched Elira breathe, shallow, steady, as if she had mastered stillness the same way he had mastered waiting for an opening in the sand. He should have moved toward her. That was the expectation. 4 hours. That was the standard time. But he didn't. Something in her silence spoke louder than screams. He wondered what she would have said if the system had allowed her a voice. He wondered what it meant that he, a killer of over 50 men, now felt more fear in this silence than he had ever felt holding a blade. There were no witnesses, no crowd, no glory, just a room, a girl, and a man who no longer knew which part of him still belonged to himself. The torch outside the door burned low. The wax tablet had already been signed. Rome would record what it needed. No one would ask what really happened in room 5 that night. Before Elira was brought to that room, she had been paraded like treasure, not through a palace, but through the same sand where her father died, gasping on his side as the mob roared. They made her stand beside his body. A soldier had wiped her cheek with his thumb and called her beautiful in Latin she barely understood. The games that day were not just for death, they were for display. And Elira was the last event. 10 girls from Thrace had been chosen, all daughters of tribal leaders, all captured when Rome burned the river villages during the spring. They were cleaned, stripped of jewelry, dressed in identical tunics, and told to keep their heads high. The crowd would enjoy them more if they looked proud. Roman officials explained that these women were not prisoners. They were symbols, living proof that Thrace had been conquered. What better way to celebrate victory than to offer its daughters to the men who made it possible? The announcer's voice cracked over the bronze horn, naming each girl and the gladiator who had earned her. A few of the gladiators stood in the sand, blood still drying on their shoulders. Elira watched one man spit into the dirt as his name was called. Another raised his arms and grinned at the crowd, already drunk on the applause. Then it was her name, Elira of the Agrianes, age 16, category 3. Assigned to Tiberius Gracchus. A crowd of 20,000 Romans cheered. They had never heard her name before, and they would never hear it again. But they cheered anyway. Not because they knew her, but because she had a face, and the games had rules. Her hands had been tied then, not for her safety, but for the image. A captured noble, silent, small, standing beside a man who had spilled blood for sport. She felt the noise of the arena like a sickness vibrating through her ribs, burning her throat even though she hadn't screamed. The guards didn't drag her. They led her like a prize horse through the gate, through the tunnels, down the steps into the dark, one torch every 20 paces. The air grew colder. The earth changed from sand to limestone, from sun to silence. She passed rooms with doors open and empty, then rooms with doors closed, then doors that were numbered in chalk. 1, 3, 5, 7. Room 5 opened. She didn't cry. She didn't resist. The guard locked the door and left. That was 3 hours ago. Now she sat in the same spot, hands still tied, waiting for the man Rome had promised her to. She had thought he would arrive quickly, but the hours passed. And when he finally stepped through the door, he didn't come to claim her. He just sat down, as if he too had been taken. Tiberius Gracchus had killed 62 men. That was the number written beside his name on the arena tablets. It was how Rome measured his worth, not by skill, not by honor, but by body count. He remembered the first time, a German boy with pale hair and wide eyes, no older than 15. They had put a dull blade in his hands and thrown him into the arena as part of the opening show. Tiberius had ended it in seconds. The boy's ribs shattered beneath a shield slam. His throat opened clean. The crowd had loved it. He had vomited in the tunnel afterward. That was 10 years ago. Now he no longer remembered most of their faces. Only the sounds, the gasps, the sobbing, the silence when someone realized they were truly going to die. He had learned not to care. Rome rewarded that. Gladiators who showed hesitation were sent to die in rigged matches. Tiberius had lasted because he did what they wanted, killed quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. But something shifted the night he sat across from Elira. She had not begged, had not spoken, just sat with her hands tied, eyes open, shoulders stiff as stone. He watched her for nearly an hour before saying anything. When he did, it came out rough. "I'm not going to touch you." No response. He cleared his throat. "I'll sit here until the time is over, then I'll leave." Still nothing. He wasn't sure if she understood Latin, but then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Why?" The word struck him harder than a blade. He had no answer prepared. "Because I'm tired? Because I hate myself? Because you remind me of someone I once loved, and I can't do this again?" He didn't say any of it. He just looked at her and said, "Because you shouldn't be here." Silence again. In the corridor outside, footsteps echoed past. Voices laughed. A guard sang something under his breath. Inside the cell, neither moved. The chains on her wrists clicked softly as she shifted. He saw the marks there, not fresh, not bleeding, but deep. She had been bound for days, maybe weeks. The torchlight caught the edge of her jaw, where a bruise was just starting to fade. Rome had touched her long before he ever walked into this room, and somehow, her silence was louder than any scream he'd ever heard. He stayed. Not because it would change anything, not because it would save her, but because it was the only rebellion left to him. Not fighting, not protecting, just not doing what was expected. That was enough. For now, when the guard returned hours later, Tiberius stood. He did not look back. The man nodded without question. Another reward completed, another entry marked, but no one wrote what actually happened in that room. Rome never recorded silence. The next morning, Elira was moved. 2 guards came at dawn, their faces blank, their steps practiced. They did not speak to her. One untied her wrists, the other gripped her arm and pulled her to her feet. Her legs buckled, not from fear, but from stiffness. She had not stood in almost a day. They dragged her through the corridor without explanation. The air smelled of oil and rust. Doors passed by, some open, some not. She did not ask where they were taking her. She already knew. The kindness she had been given in room 5, if it could be called that, was over. It had been a pause, not a pardon. Rome did not forgive. It recorded. And somewhere in the ledgers beneath the arena, a note had already been made. Prisoner Elira, Category 3, still usable, next assignment pending. They brought her to a different chamber this time. Room 8, smaller, darker. The drain in the floor was cracked. She was chained again, this time at the ankles too. She didn't resist. There was no point. The guard told her, with the tone of someone discussing a schedule, that she would be seen to shortly. Her first real assignment. The words turned her stomach, but she didn't show it. She had learned to keep her face still. Crying only made them curious. She sat in silence. The torchlight flickered. Somewhere nearby, metal scraped stone. Another lock turned. Somewhere, another girl screamed. That scream, short, sharp, quickly silenced, was more effective than any whip. It told her what was coming. How long she waited, she could not say. Time in the chambers bent strangely. Minutes felt like hours. Then the door opened. A man entered. Not Tiberius. This one was younger, sweating, still breathing hard from a match. His knuckles were split, and his eyes gleamed not with rage, but hunger. She did not speak. He didn't either. He didn't need to. What happened next was not chaotic. It was orderly, cold, methodical, exactly what the chamber had been built for. And when it was done, he left without looking back. The door closed, the lock turned. She was alone again. Something in her had cracked, but not all the way. She still remembered the silence of the first room. She still remembered that someone had once looked at her and chosen not to destroy what was already breaking. That memory became a small flame in her chest. Useless, but present. Elira didn't cry. She didn't scream. She lay on the stone floor and whispered her name under her breath like a prayer, like a protest. Elira, Elira, Elira. 3 times. Just enough to remind herself she still existed. Rome could record her as a number. The others could take what they pleased. But that name, whispered in the dark, belonged to her alone. Elira survived 6 more days. Not fully, not as herself, but enough for Rome to keep using her. They moved her between chambers like grain sacks, room 11, then room 6, then back to 8. Each time, the same ritual, a name called, a man entered. A door closed. She stopped tracking the hours. The light didn't change underground, only the footsteps told time. She started whispering less. Her name became harder to say, as if even that syllable belonged to someone else now. But in quiet moments, between assignments, when no one watched, she would trace a line into the stone with her thumbnail, a mark for each day, 6 marks, uneven, shallow but real. On the 7th morning, her body refused to stand. Her legs had swollen. Her breath came slow. A guard tried to rouse her, slapped her once. When she didn't respond, they left her lying in the corner. A physician came hours later, touched her skin, shook his head, and made a note on a clay tablet. Fever. Dehydration. Unsuitable for further use. The words were said in Latin, flat and final. That afternoon, she was gone. Not buried, not burned. Just added to a cart of spoiled inventory, other bodies, other forgotten girls. They dumped them into a pit outside the city, behind the arena kitchens, where dogs sometimes sniffed the soil and guards tossed salt over the dead to keep the smell down. Elira's name was never written again, only her number. Prisoner 432, deceased. Status, expired. There was no ceremony. But in one corridor of the hypogeum, beneath the dust and cracked limestone, a wall bore 7 faint scratches. A girl had insisted quietly, desperately, that she had lived, that she had seen, that she had endured, and for a moment, someone had sat across from her and chosen mercy. Tiberius Gracchus learned of her death from another fighter 3 days later. He said nothing, just nodded, then walked to the far end of the barracks and carved her name into the wooden beam above his cot. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't justice, it was memory. A single name scratched into rotting timber, nothing more, nothing less. Rome would forget her, history would skip her, but she had existed, she had mattered. And one man, who had killed for a decade, had chosen once not to. In a world built on silence and spectacle, sometimes the quietest choices are the loudest. She was never meant to be remembered, but you remember her now. If you believe stories like Elira's still matter, subscribe. And tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. I read them all.